In the early spring of 1843, the city of Savannah moved at its usual unhurried pace, its cobblestone streets warmed by the sun and its grand homes standing as quiet symbols of wealth, tradition, and unchallenged hierarchy. Death was not unusual in a place where illness lingered and medicine was uncertain, but when the news spread that a prominent white landowner had died suddenly in his sleep, it stirred more than polite sympathy. It stirred expectation. Men like him left behind estates, debts, legacies, and above all, wills that confirmed the natural order everyone believed in. His funeral was attended by the city's elite. Black cloth draped the entrance of his home, candles burned low, and murmured condolences filled the air. His widow, dressed in deep mourning, accepted sympathy with a stillness that many mistook for shock. She spoke little, kept her gaze lowered, and allowed others to assume she was fragile, overwhelmed, and in need of guidance. No one imagined she was already preparing to defy every unspoken rule that governed their world. The reading of the will was scheduled days later in a modest office not far from the river. Those present expected formality, not surprise. The document had been prepared years earlier, carefully sealed, and witnessed according to the law. Land, the main house, outbuildings, and money would pass to the widow. Smaller properties would be divided among distant relatives, and, as always, the enslaved people would be listed like furniture, transferred as property. That was how such things worked. That was how they had always worked. The lawyer began reading in a steady voice, each clause unfolding without interruption. The widow sat quietly, hands folded, eyes forward. At first, everything sounded ordinary, too ordinary. Then came a name that did not belong in that room, spoken aloud in a way that made the lawyer hesitate, just briefly, before continuing. It was the name of one of the household's slaves. At first, those listening assumed they had misheard. A slave might be mentioned in a will as property, but not by name alone, not separated from a list, not addressed as an individual. The lawyer read the line again, slower. This time the slave was not being transferred. He was not being sold. He was not being freed and dismissed. He was being named as an heir. A quiet disbelief spread through the room. Chairs creaked. Someone coughed sharply. The lawyer's voice tightened as he continued reading, making it clear that this was not a mistake, or a single sentence taken out of context. The document stated that upon the widow's death, a significant portion of the estate would pass to the slave. Land, money, ownership. Rights that the law itself denied to someone of his status. The widow did not react. She did not gasp or protest. She did not pretend surprise. She sat as if she had known every word by heart. That silence was more unsettling than any outburst could have been. When the reading ended, the room did not erupt into argument right away. Instead, there was a moment of stunned quiet, the kind that follows a social transgression so severe that no one is sure how to respond. Someone finally laughed, nervously, suggesting it must be a clerical error. Another suggested the man had been confused near the end of his life. A third muttered that grief had clouded everyone's judgment and the will should be reviewed again. The widow listened to all of it without speaking. Only when directly asked if she understood what had just been read did she lift her head and say calmly that she did, and that she intended to honor her husband's wishes exactly as written. That was the moment when the room turned cold. Word spread quickly, faster than the widow could have anticipated, though she may have expected it all the same. Savannah was a city built on whispers. By evening, the story had reached parlors, churches, and taverns. Each retelling grew more dramatic. Some claimed the slave was to inherit everything. Others said the widow planned to live as equals with him. A few suggested darker possibilities, hints of scandal that polite society pretended not to imagine. The slave himself had not been present at the reading. He remained at the house, unaware that his name had been spoken in a way that would change his life forever. When the widow told him later that night, she did not dress it in kindness or fear. She spoke plainly, as if stating a fact long overdue. He listened without interrupting, his expression carefully controlled. A lifetime of survival had taught him how to hide emotion. But when she finished, he asked only one question, whether the law would allow it. She did not answer directly. In the days that followed, the widow's house became a place of scrutiny. Visitors arrived under the guise of concern, each one seeking information. Some offered help in correcting the will. Others warned her gently about consequences. A few spoke more bluntly, reminding her of her position, her reputation, and the danger of inviting scandal. She thanked them all and did nothing. What unsettled the city most was not just the content of the will, but the widow's refusal to distance herself from it. She did not claim ignorance. She did not place blame on grief. She did not rush to the courts to undo the damage. Instead, she carried on as if the decision had restored something rather than destroyed it. The church elders were among the first to voice concern publicly. While slavery was woven deeply into religious justification, the idea of a slave inheriting property crossed a line they could not ignore. It suggested equality. Worse, it suggested intention. They requested a private meeting with the widow, urging her to reconsider for the sake of social harmony. She listened respectfully, then reminded them that the will was legal and that her conscience was clear. Behind closed doors, speculation turned vicious. Some insisted the slave must have been the landowner's illegitimate son. Others claimed the widow herself had formed an inappropriate attachment. There were whispers of guilt, of deathbed confessions, of secrets too heavy to be buried with the dead. No proof was offered, but none was needed. The mere possibility was enough to inflame opinion. Meanwhile, the slave remained where he had always been, moving through the house with quiet precision. Yet everything had changed. Eyes followed him now, measuring, judging. Some servants avoided him entirely, others watched with a mix of fear and curiosity. He had become a symbol, whether he wanted to be or not. By the end of that first week, it was clear that the will had done more than distribute property. It had cracked the foundation of Savannah's social order. The widow had not only lost a husband, she had inherited a battle. And by choosing to stand by his words, she had declared, whether she meant to or not, that the rules governing race, ownership, and legacy were not as immovable as everyone believed. What no one yet understood was that this was only the beginning. The will had been read, the shock had landed, and the city, deeply offended by the suggestion that a slave could be more than property, was already preparing to push back. In the days following the reading of the will, the widow's house in Savannah became a place of quiet defiance. From the outside, nothing appeared different. The shutters remained open during the day, closed at night. The garden was tended. Meals were prepared and served. Yet inside those walls, a decision was unfolding that unsettled everyone who learned of it. The widow did not retreat from society, nor did she rush to explain herself. Instead, she acted with deliberate calm, as though she were correcting a long-standing injustice rather than provoking one. The most shocking part of her behavior was not that she upheld the will, but how she treated the man named within it. He was no longer summoned only for work. He was called to sit, to listen, and eventually to speak. She instructed that he be taught to read properly, not in secret but openly, with books brought into the house without shame. When questioned about this, she replied that an heir must understand the world he would one day navigate. The word heir, spoken so plainly, sent a chill through those who heard it. She moved him from the servants' quarters into a small room within the main house. It was not a grand room, but it was private, clean, and unmistakably symbolic. This act alone fueled endless gossip. Some claimed she had lost her senses. Others said grief had warped her judgment. A few, more perceptive or more cruel, suggested that she was making a statement on purpose, daring the city to challenge her. The enslaved man himself walked carefully through this new reality. Years of discipline had taught him that visibility invited danger. He did not smile more, he did not speak unless spoken to. He accepted the new clothes provided to him, not finery, but garments that marked him as something different from both slave and free man. When he passed through the city streets on errands, people stared openly. Some looked away in disgust. Others watched with a curiosity they could not disguise. The widow began involving him in household decisions, small at first, which supplies to order, which repairs were necessary. She asked his opinion, then listened to it. This unsettled her staff more than any legal document could. They had been trained to obey hierarchy, and here it was being quietly rewritten before their eyes. Savannah's elite women were the first to confront her directly. They arrived in polite groups, faces carefully arranged into expressions of concern. Over tea they spoke of reputation, of loneliness, of the dangers a widow faced without male guidance. They hinted that aligning herself too closely with a former slave would isolate her completely. She listened, thanked them, and replied that isolation was preferable to dishonor. When pressed, she said something that spread quickly throughout the city, that her husband's will had only confirmed what he had already practiced in life. That statement igni. Ted's speculation. People began revisiting old memories, small details once ignored. The way the landowner had spoken to that particular slave, the trust he had placed in him, the responsibilities he had been given beyond what was customary. Some remembered seeing them walking together in conversation, their tones low, their expressions serious. What had once seemed like eccentricity now felt suspicious. The church responded next, more forcefully. Ministers preached sermons on order, on divine hierarchy, on the dangers of blurring lines set by God. While no names were spoken from the pulpit, everyone knew who was being addressed. Parishioners turned in their pews to glance at the widow when she attended services, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She did not stop going to church. She refused to be chased out of spaces she believed were as much hers as anyone else. Behind closed doors, men of influence began discussing legal strategies. If the will could not be overturned directly, perhaps the widow could be declared unfit to manage the estate. Perhaps the slave could be challenged as incapable of inheritance due to his status. Perhaps the city could apply pressure quietly, through threats, inspections, and social exile. None of these plans were spoken aloud in public, but the tension they created was palpable. Meanwhile, the widow continued as though time were on her side. She insisted that the man learn numbers, contracts, and the basics of property management. She allowed him access to records that no slave would ever see. Each lesson was a quiet act of rebellion. Each day that passed without her backing down was an insult to those who expected her to bend. The enslaved community watched all of this with a mix of hope and terror. Some whispered that if one man could be elevated, perhaps others might follow. Others feared backlash, knowing too well. That white anger rarely limited itself to its original target. Mothers warned their children not to stare, not to dream too loudly. Freedom, even imagined, could be dangerous. The man at the center of it all remained cautious. He understood better than anyone how fragile this protection was. He knew that one accusation, one rumor, could undo everything. He carried himself with restraint, aware that his every move was being interpreted as proof of either worthiness or threat. At night he lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar silence of a private room, wondering whether this new status was a gift or a trap. Savannah did not know what to do with a woman who refused to behave as expected. Widows were meant to mourn, then quietly accept guidance. They were not meant to challenge inheritance laws or elevate slaves. Her calm persistence was more dangerous than anger would have been. It left no clear enemy to confront, no hysteria to dismiss. By the end of that second month, it was clear that the widow's decision was not temporary. She was not waiting for the storm to pass. She was standing in it, unmoved, and the city, offended not just by her actions but by her certainty, began preparing for a more direct confrontation. The scandal was no longer contained within drawing rooms and sermons. It was becoming a battle over power, law, and the uncomfortable truth that one woman's choice had exposed cracks in a system everyone depended on. What began as a will had now become a challenge, and Savannah was not a city that forgave challenges easily. As the scandal deepened, Savannah began to speak in a different voice. What had once been polite concern hardened into suspicion, and suspicion into accusation. The widow could feel it whenever she stepped outside her home, the way conversations stopped when she entered a room, the way smiles tightened and eyes lingered just a moment. Tea too long. The city was no longer asking why she had done what she did. It was asking what she was hiding. Rumors spread faster than facts ever could. In parlors and taverns across Savannah, people whispered that blood, not conscience, lay at the heart of the will. The most persistent rumor claimed that the enslaved man named as heir was not merely favored by the late husband, but related to him. An illegitimate son, born in secret, raised in chains to protect a reputation. The idea shocked some and satisfied others. It explained too much too neatly to be ignored. Those who disliked the widow favored a different story. They suggested that her attachment to the man was personal, even improper. That grief had weakened her resolve and blurred boundaries that society insisted must remain fixed. The fact that she had kept him in the house, educated him, and treated him with respect became twisted into evidence of something shameful. The widow understood that in Savannah, a woman's virtue was both fragile and easily weaponized. The enslaved man heard these whispers too, though rarely to his face. He noticed how people stared more openly now, how some white men looked at him with hostility rather than curiosity. He sensed danger not in overt threats, but in tone and posture. The lessons he received inside the house could not prepare him for the hatred gathering beyond its walls. He began to understand that his elevation had made him a symbol, and symbols were often destroyed to preserve order. One evening, while sorting through old papers, the widow discovered a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon. They were written in her husband's hand, dated years earlier. She read them alone, her expression unreadable. Whatever she found there seemed to confirm something she had already known. From that night on, she guarded those letters carefully, keeping them hidden, yet closer than before. When asked later if her husband had loved the man he named as heir, she replied only that love took many forms, not all of them acceptable to polite society. The city's ministers were no longer content with indirect sermons. A small group requested a formal meeting, framing it as spiritual concern. They spoke of sin, of temptation, of the danger of allowing emotion to override God's design. One of them hinted that the widow's soul, and perhaps her husband's, were at risk. She listened, then calmly asked whether compassion itself had become a sin. None of them answered. As pressure mounted, the courts began to take interest, not officially at first, but quietly. Clerks examined the will, searching for technical flaws. Lawyers debated whether a slave, even if later freed, could legally inherit property designated before emancipation. The widow was advised more than once to preemptively alter the will or establish trusts that would redirect the inheritance. Each time she refused. The enslaved man sensed a shift in her as well. She became more guarded, more strategic. Lessons became more intense, focused on survival rather than theory. She taught him how to read contracts not as promises, but as weapons. She explained how the law could be bent without breaking, how appearances mattered as much as truth. It was clear she was preparing him not for comfort, but for conflict. Within the enslaved community, opinions were divided. Some viewed him as a beacon, proof that the system was not as absolute as it pretended to be. Others feared he was drawing fire that would burn them all. Mothers warned their children not to speak his name too freely. Older men advised him to leave if he could, to disappear before the city decided his existence was intolerable. He listened to all of it and said nothing. Leaving was not as simple as walking away. He knew too much now. He had been seen. The most dangerous rumor emerged late one night, carried by a man who had overheard a private conversation. It suggested that the widow herself had pressured her husband to write the will, that the decision had not been his alone. In a society that valued male authority above all else, this accusation was explosive. It recast the widow not as a grieving wife honoring her husband's wishes, but as a manipulator who had corrupted both law and legacy. That rumor changed everything. Men who had previously hesitated began speaking openly about intervention. If the will was the product of undue influence, it could be challenged. If the widow was unfit, she could be removed from control of the estate. And if the slave was at the center of this influence, then his presence became not just offensive, but dangerous. The widow received her first explicit threat shortly after. It came disguised as advice, delivered by a family acquaintance. He warned her that accidents happened, reputations could be ruined overnight, and that stubbornness was rarely rewarded in Savannah. She thanked him for his concern and escorted him out. That night she instructed the enslaved man never to leave the house alone. The letters she had found began to weigh heavily on her mind. They were proof, she believed, but also confession. They revealed a bond between her husband and the man that went beyond ownership, rooted in guilt, responsibility, and something like affection. Whether that bond was blood or conscience mattered less than what it represented, a crack in the moral certainty upon which the city relied. As the third session of this unfolding drama drew to a close, Savannah was no longer content to whisper. The truth, whatever it was, hovered just out of reach, pulling the city forward with equal parts fascination and fear. The widow stood at the center of it, calm but increasingly isolated. The enslaved man, now an heir in name if not in law, understood that the greatest danger was yet to come. The past was pressing forward, demanding acknowledgement, and Savannah, so proud of its traditions, was beginning to realize that some legacies, once exposed, could not be buried again.